All right, so the Flutter spoon, man, in about 2010, this was about the hottest bait on the market for a couple years. It was a big trend, guys using it here at Lake Fork, where I am, is where it kind of started, called the Lake Fork Flutter spoon. Guys use jigging spoons for a long time, but this thing really especially like Kentucky Lake and Pickwick, TVA lakes, anywhere guys fished offshore, this got to be a really big deal, and then it kind of faded. And there's been some other spoons, but I tell you what, with LiveScope, it's really made a comeback. And if you're just fishing, anytime the fish are offshore, anywhere from early summer through the fall into the winter, a Flutter spoon is one of the best baits out there, but you really have to dial in your retrieve to get it to work. Let me show you how. All right, guys, so the Flutter spoon I'm going to talk about is what's referred to a lot of times as the fork Flutter spoon, or just a Flutter spoon. A number of different companies make these. They're about 5 inches long, silver or gold in most of them. You get a little bit of accent colors. You'll notice the one thing I put on the top is a swivel. That takes out a lot of line twists, going to make it a lot easier. But outside of that, if you want to change out the hook, you kind of fish them out of the package. And there's big ones. You can go with that Ben Parker style, that big 10-inch spoon on some of the big bass lakes. Works well. There's little 2 and 3 inch versions. But the 5 inch is kind of the killer. That's the year-round one. It seems like it'll always work. And a couple of the things that really come into play here is, first and foremost, it'll flutter a little bit or a lot, or just barely kind of wiggle back and forth. I'll get into that. That's the biggest key on making fish bite. But also I'm going to get into how fast you rip it. That's going to impact it a lot. And then whether you keep your line tight or you keep it slack, all this stuff's going to make a huge difference. So let me dive into it, show you different retrieves for the different mood of the fish to trigger more fish to bite it. So the biggest thing to talk about on a Flutter spoon is the flutter that it has, hence the name Flutter spoon. If you feed it total slack, if I throw it out there and don't follow it down, if I just keep a lot of slack in my line, it's going to make this really wide flutter going down. It's kind of like a dying shad. They love it. A lot of times, if they're active, that flutter is going to make them eat it. The way we all started doing it is we would throw it out there, you rip it up, get a really fast rise, and then that flutter, and man, they would smoke it. And that's simply cast it out. You give total slack to your line. I mean, you just free spool it down, give it total slack, and it's going really wide. It's fluttering. Once it gets to the bottom, I either rip it or pop it twice, snap it aggressively, or I can reel it really fast. If I snap it, it's going to jerk and jump and then start to flutter. If I reel it, it's going to be a little bit tighter, and the spoon's going to go kind of more like this up. Whereas if you snap it, it's more of a straight up. But depending on the mood, the flutter's the big deal there. So feeding all that slack, and then you just repeat that all the way back to the boat. Rip, and then totally drop your line. Drop your rod right away. Give it that slack back again, like a Texas rig or something. You're going to lift a worm, and then I'm going to follow it back down. I'm going to keep the slack out of my line. With the Flutter spoon, when you want to make it flutter, you rip, and then I just almost drop my rod. I go down and keep a big bow. So your line has a big bow to it, and that gives the big flutter. So that slack line is going to give you this classic fluttering motion. It's wide. It doesn't fall that fast, really. It's really going wide side to side and slowly goes down. Where a regular jigging spoon, those flat ones, they're going to drop pretty fast right back down. Sometimes that faster fall is a trigger. Now, a lot of times, and especially more as we get into the fall, and if you start to pressure the fish, you start to fish a school for a while, that big flutter, sometimes that doesn't work as well. And if you control the slack, I showed a second ago, you keep total slack in it, it's going to get the flutter. If you start to control it, keep the slack out of it, what's going to happen, instead of turning on its side, you're going to make it so the top stays stationary, but the bottom starts to wiggle going down. And that's a more controlled fall. And then if I really keep it kind of tight and almost worm fish it, I can get the thing so it's not moving a lot, and it's kind of a slow dying minnow or shad or something just coming back down to them, and I can control the fall rate. I can make it slower or faster. Typically, the colder it gets, the more I go to those subdued type falls, and then you mix in how aggressively you snap it up. So what I'll do a lot of times in the fall or the dead of the winter, when the water starts getting down to around 50 and especially goes in the 40s, instead of that rip, you want to kind of lift up like a worm, or I just give it about 3 slow cranks to the handle with no slack, just slowly raise it, and then I'll follow it down with my rod tip. So basically what you have is an option of a flutter with total slack, kind of worm fishing with a little bit of slack, and then tight line with virtually no slack. This would be the flutter when I rip it and just drop my rod down, give it total slack, let it hit the bottom, reel up the slack, rip, total slack again. The worm retrieve, kind of the medium, I pick it up like I would a worm, and then slow follow my line back down, let it get to the bottom, pick up the slack, worm, raise your rod, control it back down, just with a little bit of slack, a little bit of a bow. And then the third is the tight line, where I start with my line being tight on the bottom. I reel it up 3 cranks and do nothing with my rod. And if it's really cold, I might reel it like 1 and just let it go back down, 1 or 2. Never really moving the rod, you feel a bite, and then you pull up right away. So then the other variable is how fast do you pick it up, how far do you pick it up. In the summertime, kind of like what you do with a hair jig, I can rip it up off the bottom. That reel retrieve, I can pull the thing, I can give it 7, 8, 9 cranks, burst it off the bottom, and then tight line, let it kind of waddle back down to them. So it's a sprint and then just fall back down, sprint, fall back down. Or if I'm doing the worm retrieve, in the wintertime, I might want to pick it up only a foot off the bottom. So I'll just barely lift my rod and then follow it back down. Summertime, or if I'm trying to find the fish, trigger him, something like that, I might pick up my rod and move that line 8 to 10 feet, follow it back down. Pick it up 8 to 10 feet, so it goes from about 9 o'clock up to about 12 o'clock, and then follow it back down. So 9 to 12, follow it back down. That's a variation there. In the past, you know, what we used to do is really experiment with this. You throw it out, you try a variety of retrieves. All of a sudden, when it's like, well, when I rip it up from about 9 to 11, that works. If I barely pick it up, if I burn it 8 cranks, that's what works. The neat thing now with LiveScope, obviously, you get to see in real time how they react to it. You can try the faster ones, you see if the fish react to it. That's why LiveScope guys have really started using the flutter spoon again. So vary the retrieve. It's a pretty versatile weapon. Fish that are suspended, you can keep it up above them, and that's the whole trick. You work it up above them, let it fall down to their face. They typically won't go down to it, but they will follow it down if it's coming from above. So if you're using LiveScope, it's definitely a weapon of choice that you can use anytime the fish are offshore. Try those different retrieves. I think you're going to catch a few more fish with a good old Lake Fork spoon, and to catch some big ones too. Trust me on that. Good luck, guys.